Good morning, this is Jason Oakes, and this is part of my podcast series on the Wyoming Health Watch. If you are interested in hearing more of my podcast, please go to wyominghealthwatch.com, where you can find all of them. This morning was an interesting and very informative morning. I was invited to participate with a number of very interesting people in a discussion regarding the future economics of Wyoming. Wyoming is my home state. It's my wonderful state. I love it dearly. But it's going through some transitions, not only right now, but it has been, and it will likely do so in the future. But one thing that came up is transitions are normal. And transitions, although they sometimes can be scary because they're unknown, are nonetheless to be expected. And the way that we approach them often can determine the way we fare through them. We had a great conversation this morning because there's been recent, news headlines and various items that have come out of Cheyenne, where our capital is, about the bleak look, the grim look, or forecast, if you will, for our state revenues. And for those who are unfamiliar with Wyoming, we get our revenues, a substantial amount of our revenues, through the fossil fuel industry. So when the fossil fuel industry is struggling, there's a direct impact on the economic, perseverance, if you will, of our state. And that's going on right now, which is something to reflect on, because if we step back for a moment and this had come up this morning, and we think about, we have a Republican ruled Senate, we have a Republican in the executive office, and we've had that for the last 3 years, and yet the last 3 years has not been a lucrative time period for Wyoming. In fact, quite the opposite. And we've in Wyoming, we have what they refer to as a slush fund, which is our emergency rainy day fund. What we've had to tap recently because we need money for revenue, for social services, for schools, for cities, you name it. And the reason we've had to tap those is because we're not getting the revenues on the fossil fuel end of things. And that's concerning because we are approaching a new election, as we all know. Regardless of how you think it may fare it, I don't think any of us have that crystal ball. And if the Republicans maintain the executive, if you look at the last several years, we're still probably going to continue to struggle slightly. If the Democrats take over, I suspect and would anticipate that Wyoming will struggle even more so. At least with Trump in office, there have been some rollbacks and some various fossil fuel industry guidelines and restrictions that should have helped us more than I think others would have anticipated. But in any event, they haven't. And we're having to tap into our rainy day fund to take care of simple things like schools. And that was of biggest concern to me last year and also last week when the new budgets came out. We have a huge shortfall, and that shortfall directly impacts our schools. And that's something that is of serious concern. And I've been blogging about this, and I've also been doing some podcasts about this other issue that nobody's talking about. I think I'm the only one talking about it. I brought it up this morning at our forum, and nobody there was familiar with this. But let me tell you, this is going to be something we need to pay very close attention to as Wyomingites, and frankly as any other state that has fossil fuel as something they rely even semi-heavily on. And this is the fossil fuel / climate crisis litigation, is what I'm calling it, that is flowing like a steam engine through the federal courts right now. And those climate crisis litigations are against all the major corporations that you can think of right now. You name it, Exxon, BP, Chevron, all of them are having to face a day of reckoning in trial. And I will tell you, there are a whole host. I mean, there are hundreds of cases that are pending right now that are waiting for their day in court. And this came to a head just last week when the New York Attorney General, who filed a large case against Exxon, started a bench trial in New York against Exxon, representing investors, claiming that Exxon had lied, frankly, that they had lied to the investors who had invested in Exxon, claiming that their role or quasi-role in climate change was nowhere near what was alleged. And the New York Attorney General is holding them to task and asserting that they have lied about that their role is significant. And in opening statements last week, he requested $1.6 billion from the judge. He told the judge that was the number he would be asking the judge to award. And in those circles, a lot of people took notice. I don't think in Wyoming, but a lot of people took notice. And one was the Attorney General from Massachusetts, that while this case was pending last week, the Massachusetts Attorney General filed an enormous lawsuit also against Exxon, alleging the same thing that New York did, but also making it a broader complaint against not only Exxon with respect to their representation to investors, but also with respect to the impact it is having from a public perspective. And this stems from the same arguments that they have been alleged to have been dishonest about their role in climate change. And these lawsuits, interestingly, are coming on the heels of the opioid litigation, which my firm's been very involved with. In the opioid litigation, the assertions have been that these huge manufacturers and distributors of opioids have created a public nuisance, which has caused the opioid epidemic that is impacting communities all over the country. And this public nuisance theory was somewhat novel when this litigation started, but has since become just the norm. And the reason for that is, number one, there was the first opioid trial that went before an Oklahoma state judge. The Attorney General of Oklahoma tried that case, and all the defendants that were involved in that settled before trial, with the exception of Johnson & Johnson. And the state court judge found that Johnson & Johnson played a role with their opioids with impacting the opioid epidemic that's at issue in Oklahoma, and ordered Johnson & Johnson to pay $570 million. Now, that was a far cry from the $17 billion that was asked for. But nonetheless, the significance of that ruling is that public nuisance was found to be a legitimate cause of action against this company, and moreover that the court found Johnson & Johnson liable and responsible and ordered them to pay a significant sum of money. Subsequent to that, all the opioid cases that were filed in the federal court before Judge Daniel Polster, which was all consolidated before him in Cleveland, Ohio, was set for trial just earlier this month. Those cases all settled literally on the eve of trial, or darn close. And again, one thing people don't realize is the defendants had asserted that this public nuisance argument was not a legitimate argument in this context in a summary judgment motions, all of which were denied by Judge Daniel Polster, which allowed the plaintiffs to have their day in court. Those cases are still pending. Only a handful of them settled, although they settled for enormous numbers. And in the event of a settlement, there is no appeal, so there will be no sort of appellate review of those decisions. And that's where things stand right now. And so that public nuisance assertion and that cause of action has now grown to be an enormous weapon against companies who are creating, or alleged to have created, nuisances within certain communities. And I think the breadth of this potential litigation is enormous. And you're starting to see it right now by school districts that are filing public nuisance cases against vape companies because they're alleging because of these vape devices and the marketing that occurred early on to minors, that they have now created an enormous nuisance in the public school system. And those cases are now going to maneuver themselves through the federal litigation or in lawsuits, not only federal but also state. And now we're also seeing many of these cases that have been pending against climate crisis defendants, or those alleged to have been contributors to climate change and climate crisis, are now getting their day in court. And I think, bringing this back to where I originally started from an economic perspective from Wyoming, I shared this morning that I do not believe that politics will play near the role that private litigation will in the years to come with climate change. If there are enormous verdicts, and there are a number of cases pending, and there's just statistically a likelihood there will be enormous verdicts coming down in the next couple years in these sorts of climate crisis litigation cases. If there are enormous verdicts, it will force change. And it will force change in a way that for states like Wyoming that rely heavily on fossil fuel industry, it could be very harmful. So I urge people to pay attention to this, especially our leaders in Wyoming, because it's going to happen whether they like it or not. But one way, and I also shared, and there was a lot of, I wouldn't say there's a lot of pessimism, but there certainly was an aura of pessimism at the forum I was at this morning regarding, looking at tomorrow and how that affects Wyoming. And I didn't share that pessimism. I believe that we look at problems not with an answer of can't do, or we cannot accomplish that. And I encourage people to look at problems with a question. The question being, how can we? And simply by that mild shift in your perspective and the way that you approach a problem, whether it be at the top level of your leadership in your company or in your state, or even at a level of teaching your kids to work through problems, that slight shift in perspective can mean all the difference in the world. And if we can look at the potential future and economic woes of Wyoming and ask ourselves, how can we get ahead of the curve? I think there's a lot of things that can be done. I think, for instance, there's no reason that Wyoming couldn't be the leader in the entire country for the mining of rare earth metals. We have somehow, as a country, outsourced that to China. And I don't understand that. I don't understand why we would do that when things like fighter jets require literally 500,000 pounds or something enormous of rare earth metals to build them. You can imagine the crisis we would have on our hands if we got into a conflict with China, and they're the very country that we purchase rare earth metals from. In Wyoming, we already have infrastructure established here because of the coal industry. It would not be difficult to immediately become, in my view, the country's leader in discovering and mining for rare earth metals. Number one, that is an exciting thing. That would be something that would put a whole host of people to work, and it would also be something that people in my state could feel, I think, very patriotic about. There are also other things that can be done, like I had somebody suggest putting a high-speed train between Denver and Cheyenne. Denver is exploding right now. People can't afford homes there. People are getting taxed right and left. We don't have income tax in Wyoming. We have very affordable housing in Wyoming. And can you imagine if you could hop a high-speed train from Cheyenne and go into Denver, work, and be home by 6 o'clock? That would be remarkable. And then also be able to keep that money you would otherwise be paying to income tax in Colorado. I think a high-speed train between Cheyenne and Denver would create or establish Cheyenne as one of the fastest-growing cities in the entire country. But these things require thought. These things require change and a willingness to embrace the reality of the future. Now, there were some people at the forum, and they are entitled to their own opinion, that didn't agree with me on my thoughts about climate crisis litigation and how that could or could not affect Wyoming, and they're certainly entitled to disagree with me. The only thing I would share, and the thing I shared with them, is that they may be right, I may be wrong. But if I'm right, and we anticipate this, and we get ahead of the curve we're going to protect and prevent and preempt a whole lot of stress and a whole lot of heartache and economic woes for our state. If I am wrong, we're still in a good spot. We're still in a good spot because we've further established Wyoming as having revenue sources that are outside and non-dependent on the fossil fuel industry in the event it becomes an issue down the road. And we all know that at some point there will be a Democrat who's voted for president. The pendulum will swing back, and it always does. It swings back and forth. And when that happens, it will be an additional restraint on the fossil fuel industry, which will, by extension, harm our state. So, in my view, there is no harm in getting out in front of the curve. Also, I think there's a lot of optimism that we can look at in doing that, and a lot of ability that we can broaden our horizons and also broaden our strength as a state if we start thinking about tomorrow and anticipating the challenges we have ahead of us instead of trying to hang on to yesterday. Please send me your thoughts on this. I love getting into great conversations. I think the forum this morning got my creative juices going on this. So we had a great conversation. Not all of us agreed, but that's the point of the forum. I enjoyed listening to other people's perspectives, and I hope they enjoyed listening to mine. This is Jason Oakes. This is your Wyoming Health Watch. Please go to wyominghealthwatch.com for more information. And if you have questions or if you want to email me, please do so. I read each and every email that comes through Wyoming Health Watch. Have a great day.